Local stories, local people. We're taking you inside Western Mass news. It's the Even Better Western Mass podcast with Dave Madsen.
Good to have you with us for this edition of Even Better Western Mass, where each week we talk with newsmakers here in Western Mass or people who are making a difference each and every day. This week, I visit with an old friend, Scott Coen. Scott and I worked together for about 15 years here at Western Mass News, but Scott's been a fixture on the radio and TV scene here in Western Massachusetts for about 35 years now. Scott and I sat down a couple of weeks ago at our MGM studios in Springfield.
Hey, it seems like old times.
It does. It's good to see you.
It really does. This is how we used to sit at the desk. You were on the corner and I was right here.
I was. The equipment is different, more modern, because it's been a while. But no, this is it's the first time I've been down here.
There you go. You come down here and do a little gambling and...
I don't.
No.
MGM has not gotten any of my money.
Your money stays in your pocket.
It stays in my pocket.
You work too hard for it.
I do.
Let's tell folks, since it's been 7 years.
It'll be actually, Dave, April, mid-March, so a month from now, it will be 8 years.
8 years.
I left in 2012 and
right.
started for the Saga stations in Springfield and Northampton.
Because you're still here, Scott? Every day?
Yeah, somebody asked me, that's the thing, just like you, what are you doing these days? I think I'm doing sports in the morning on, I appear on Rock 102 on Mondays with Baxton O'Brien. I do sports every morning for WHMP, The River. I'm heard on Hits, Oldies, and I'm going to start doing some work for HLL at the Hall of Fame soon. So that's six radio stations, five every morning, and then Baxton O'Brien on Mondays.
I mean, you stop and think about the dynamic of radio today. Back when we both started, before everything was deregulated, I can remember you couldn't own more than 7 TVs, 7 AMs, and 7 FMs in any given market.
Yep.
How that has changed.
It has changed. And the Saga company that I work for is based out of Michigan, and they have Rock 102 and Laser. We have an oldie station now in Northampton. We have the hit station, WHMP, The River, and then we also own HAI, AM and FM in Greenfield and Bear Country. And then there's stations up in Keene, New Hampshire. So it's all just like it's right up and down the I-91 corridor.
I think, that HMP was where I started.
Yeah.
Back 50 years ago.
And Barbara Cushing is still there and still... talks about you all the time.
50 years now.
Yeah.
And, but back then, the DeRose family had a stake in WHYN and the Daily Hampshire Gazette and WHMP, but WHMP couldn't be in the DeRose family name. It was instead in the name of, I think it was a brother-in-law or whatever, a dentist in Northampton.
Wow.
And that's, so you look at how things change. But
well, and how things have changed. I remember when I first started at Channel 40 back in 1987, Gil Lefkovich was the general manager, and he would not let you do local radio because he thought, we were competing against each other, when in fact the radio always enhanced the TV stuff. So, and now you can work for multiple companies. It's the Wild West. There are no rules anymore.
And add this podcast and everything else to it. It's like you don't even have to really have a job sometimes. It's nice because of the steady income.
Yep.
But the number to me, podcasts now are the old local radio.
Yep.
Where you have talk and things like this. It's like that's what I like about this now is we can sit down for a half an hour instead of talking 15-second sound bites about who you are, Scott Coen.
Well,
this is your life. I mean, everybody knows who he is, but you've been in this business 45. Close to it, 40 years.
I started the first time that I was ever paid to do this was St. Patrick's Day, 1980.
1980.
So that's
40 years.
40 years ago. 40 years.
So you started when you were 10.
I started when I was 10. No, I actually.
Now, was that in Maine?
It was in Presque Isle, Maine. It was the 203rd market in the country.
Out of what, 210?
Out of like 210.
Yeah.
And it was WAGM, and the station was so small that it was a CBS affiliate for news and most programs, but they took NBC programs every once in a while too. And I was there for 6 months, and it was great. And then I went down to Texas and then made my way back up here.
Now, how'd you wind up back up here?
So Pete, I went to Texas. My folks still live there, and so I wanted to be close to them. And I was down there for about 5.5 years, and then wanted to get back to New England. So I started, sniffing around, and I went up to Portland, Maine, and just freelanced a little bit. And then there was a guy from Holyoke, Pete Dragon.
Pete Dragon, yeah.
Who worked at Channel 40, and I went to college with. And they Channel 40 lost their sports guy. Paul Johnson, I think his name was. He went on to a bigger market. And Pete said, do you want to come and work in Springfield? And I'm like, I guess. Came down, had never been here before, came down for the interview, and we've been here now for 30 years.
30 years. And the rest is history.
The rest is history.
But then from then you did a lot of freelancing. You've covered a lot of things.
I have.
Not just local sports.
No. So when I left 40 after a couple of years, I started freelancing, and I went down to Channel 61 in Hartford when they started up their 10 o'clock Fox News.
89, yeah.
Yep. And then a person who was there went to Boston to Channel 56, and I started freelancing at 56 and actually did sports in Boston for 10 years. And I've anchored in at Channel 30 in Hartford for a long time. I anchored at Channel 10 in Providence for quite a while. And then I did horse racing for ESPN. And when my daughter was born, I was actually, funny story, I was coming back from the Kentucky Derby in 1996, so May of 96, and we had worked, I think we worked almost 50, 60 hours that week.
Sure.
And I was exhausted, and all I wanted to do was get off the plane and go to bed for a couple of days. And I got off the plane, I got home, I just wanted to go to sleep, and my wife Merle told me that she was pregnant with our daughter. And so when Casey came along, and the ESPN horse racing job was the best job I ever had. We traveled literally all over the world covering horse racing. But you have a child all of a sudden, and the jet set lifestyle doesn't really work out.
Dynamic changes.
Yeah. Everything changes, and I was really lucky to. So I continued to freelance in Boston, and Mike Rattay, who was the sports director here
at 40,
they wanted to make my job in Boston full time, and I wasn't really prepared to move out east because we had a house here and everything else. Mike got offered the job that I was doing part-time, full-time, and then I applied for his job in Springfield and got it, and that's how I ended up back at Channel 40 full-time.
And in between times, too, you did sports talk at HYN.
Sports talk
for quite a few years.
Yeah, sports talk at HYN. I actually did weekends at the old at WEEI in Boston when they were in the Schraft building when they first started out. And so I was kind of bebopping all over the place. And now the sports guys in Boston do the TV radio thing. They do both. I was one of the first guys to do radio and television in Boston back in 1991, 2, 3, 4. And I think it was really funny. I used to drive, I'd leave after the 10 o'clock sports and drive home. You drive right by Fenway Park.
Sure.
And I sat there and I was like, I thought about it. And even though I was just, freelancing, I was one of, I think, maybe 12 on-air TV sports guys in Boston. There were 12 jobs, and I had one of them. And now there's 12 guys, 24 guys at Nesson alone.
Sure.
So it's really changed.
They almost down there. I mean, back in the day when you were in Radio Boston, I think Eddie Andelman was probably the big name down there.
Eddie Andelman was still doing his morning show.
Yeah.
And Eddie took a liking to me because he thought I was Jewish. And so he took a shine to me, and he was always really, really nice to me.
Yeah, you think back on those days. In Boston now, I look at these sportscasters on EEI and on the NBC Sports,
the NBC Sports,
and everything. They're like interchangeable parts.
They are.
I mean, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. They're writing. They're writing for their websites. They're doing the TV thing. They're on the radio during the day. Yeah, it's so different than when I started. and when I was doing it, and you've got about 10 more years than I do.
Let's talk about how sports has changed, because when you got into it, your first full-time job in 1980, ESPN was just starting
out.
But if you wanted sports, you got it from your local stations.
You did.
How that dynamic has changed over the years.
Yeah. So, and I've told a lot of the young guys who are doing sports in Boston now that when we did a show called Weekend Scoreboard on Channel 56, and the news went from 10 to 10:30, and then we had this half-hour wrap-up show, and there was listen to this. Well, there was no internet back then. If you wanted to know what was going on, you had to watch our sportscast.
Or wait for the paper the next morning. And, obviously, we all know you don't have to do that now. But, yeah, we would run like 8 minutes of Red Sox highlights in the first segment, or the Patriots or whatever. And then we always had some feature of some sort. And then we just, like on a Sunday night, we would rip through one highlight of every NFL game. And people watched because that's one of the few places they could see it. And you think back then, too, with the Red Sox, 162 games weren't broadcast. There was maybe 38, 40 games a year.
Yep.
So the coverage you got from those games were the crews on the scene.
Yeah, we would. What the funny thing was, we would watch and so like where we are now, everybody has a remote studio at Fenway Park. So it's just you're down there, you can do your thing. We would watch the game on Channel 38, and about the seventh inning, we would call a cab, and we would cab down to Fenway, go into the locker room just almost as the game ended, do our post-game interviews, jump back in a cab, and go back to the station and put everything together for the 10 o'clock news.
Well, that was the other part of it, too. We weren't doing all the news that we're doing today.
Yep.
I mean, Channel 7 in Boston is wall-to-wall news. Wall-to-wall news. And the other affiliates down there, too. And it's just how things have changed, and the fact that really local sports in smaller markets isn't an entity anymore.
It's not.
I mean, I think of the heyday at 40 for those years. I mean, we were doing Friday Football Fever, we were doing the Above the Rim, the basketball show, and everything else. The focus, yes, we still covered the Patriots and the Celtics and all that kind of stuff, but the shift focus to local sports, which for a long time was just the dynamic of local radio.
Right. If you put, we were putting, the way I used to describe it was, we were putting people's kids on TV, and I would, you'd go out on, I remember going to the 99 in East Longmeadow when Casey was growing up, and you go in there for lunch on a Saturday afternoon, and there were families there. And they would go, oh my God, we love going home. Everybody goes home after the game and watches Friday Football Fever. One of the best compliments that I was ever paid, Joe's in Northampton.
Yep.
Okay, landmark. Everybody knows
that is the gathering place for after games.
After games, yeah. And the Hampshire County referees basketball told me that after they were done, they would all go to Joe's for pizza and beer after the games, and they would look forward to watching Above the Rim on the TVs at Joe's. And when you're doing it, you don't realize who's watching or why and how important it is to them, because you're just doing it. But when you hear the stories, that was one of the best compliments I ever got in my career.
I know one of the things you insisted upon, and you were upset when we couldn't get to it, was to make sure that you covered every kid that scored their 1,000th point.
Yeah, I remember, and I still do it on the radio.
Yeah.
I still make a point of doing it on the radio. But I think one year in particular, I think, we had like 15 kids. And whether we had to go to Mohawk High School or Palmer or anywhere in between, we made a point. The balloons, the mom and dad, the signs, it was great. That's what I miss.
Yeah, and it is. I can remember, to me, to this day, it's one of the funnest stories I've ever heard, because I was just up at Hampshire Regional the other day. That's where my kids went to high school. But Dominic Aielli, who's now in Boston.
Yes.
And on a Friday night, you sent Dominic up to Hampshire Regional to cover a basketball game.
Right. And which there's no easy way to get to Hampshire Regional from Springfield.
And Dominic would come in every weekend from Boston. So this was like sending him to Siberia.
Kind of, sort of. Where am I going tonight? You're going to West Hampton. He's like, where's that? I go, just don't worry about it. Here are the directions. And, there was no, no Google Maps.
Nothing.
They were handwritten directions that I got from, the AD many years ago, and they were in the drawer, and we sent them to West Hampton.
Now, if memory serves me correct, it started to snow a little bit, and he wound up going off the road.
Just crazy.
He came back and he said, "Don't ever send me there again."
Yeah, we had that's covering the high school stuff and those 1,000 points and everything else it's the one big thing that I miss about doing this job, and I still get to do it on the radio. So I make a point of it. I do a high school sports report every morning, and we're coming into the playoffs, and kids are scoring. Seniors are scoring their 1,000 points. So still get to do it.
When you think back on covering local sports stories, and I may put you on the spot here, what is there one that sticks out to you more than any of the others?
Well, it was fun, covering Travis Best and Rebecca Lobo. That was fun.
That's when we realize how old we are now, because they're, I think, in their late 40s or 50s.
Well, you want to know? I can tell you how old I am. Kendrick Perkins, who is now retired and like an analyst on television. I covered his father, Kenneth Perkins, when his father was in college, and now Kendrick Perkins is through his NBA career and on television. But back to your question about the most favorite thing, I enjoyed my relationships with people like Vi Goodenow and Sherry Webb, and Donna Woodcock and Frank Tudrin and Dan McLaughlin and Bob Listowski. I mean,
Howie Burns, you name them. Yeah,
you name them. It just goes on and on. So it's there's not like one specific event, but it was really just the relationships that I, in many ways, still have.
Let me ask you, starting out in sports, the first big event you covered, the first time you were in the Red Sox locker room or at Fenway Park or whatever else, how long did it take you to get over being enamored with all of that?
Well, I made a critical mistake that I was up in Presque Isle, Maine. Actually, no. I got. Do you know the name Jack Crowley?
Yes.
Jack Crowley was
the Sox. Yeah.
He from the Red Sox. He was their PR guy. This story is from 1975.
That was before Dick Bresciani moved into that.
That was before Dick Bresciani moved in there. And so I was working for this little paper, like the Reminder for New Jersey. It was called the Echo Sentinel. And I was going to college in Boston. I knew that already. And I got a press pass from Jack Crowley to come up to Fenway. And we came up in the summertime, and I went to the ballpark with my little camera bag, and I was just sitting there. I was in the locker room. I remember chatting with Bill Lee, Daryl Johnson, I think.
In the mid-'70s, yeah, he was the manager.
Yeah, and just sat there, and I was just like, you're like, I'm sitting in the Red Sox dugout at Fenway Park.
Yeah.
So that was my first, and then all the World Series games and I've covered the only major sports event that I haven't covered. I have never covered the Masters, and I haven't covered Wimbledon, but all the others I have.
I'm guessing on your bucket list, the Masters is one you'd like to
cover.
And
I'd like to go without having to work at it and just go in and have a beer and enjoy myself. So we'll see.
I've got some friends who are going down. This is the second year they went down. They said there's just no experience like it.
Yeah, and you can get tickets from a lottery, and sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. So
what's the big first sporting event you covered?
The first big one? Let's see. I would say, well, I covered Dallas Cowboy football, covered the Astros at the Astrodome. Geez, Dave. I was on the floor for Game 6 of the 1981 NBA Finals when the Celtics beat the Rockets in Game 6. I was on the floor covering the game for my station in Beaumont. That was the first big one, and they won it, and I was right next to the I guess it's the O'Brien Trophy now.
Yeah.
It's rubbing elbows with Red Auerbach, Brent Musburger, Casey Jones.
He was.
So That was the first big one.
You know, you talk about inside the Red Sox clubhouse. I think one of the first times I went in there was 1986, and I was at 22, and I went down with John Dutzman just to be there.
John Dutzman.
And who I see is now moving to Hawaii.
Yeah, I see him on Facebook.
And I have Hawaii stories with John Dutzman to talk about.
You do?
Oh, I do.
You do.
But anyhow, it was, so we went down there and I said, you know, I carried the bag for him.
Yeah.
I just wanted to be down there.
Just want to be there.
And one of the first things I saw was, back in that day, the bleachers at Fenway Park, there was a fence and barbed wire because they didn't want the riffraff getting out to the other part. Well, now it's all the same. I ran into Ray Flynn, who was mayor of Boston then.
Yeah.
And he was just kind of with the people.
Yep.
But I remember being in the clubhouse, and this is, and the rest of the players are there, you know, celebrating champagne, the whole 9 yards. And that was the year Tom Seaver played for them for like 3 months.
Oh, my goodness. Wow.
And I look over, and there's Seaver sitting on a countertop like this by the hot dog machine, eating a hot dog, just taking it all in because he had been there.
He'd been there.
You know?
Yep.
And it kind of put everything into perspective for me. It's like, you know, I'm going to let the kids have their fun.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think he pitched in the postseason then, but.
You know, it's funny about Seaver. So 2019, last year, was the 50th anniversary of the
Miracle Mets
of the 1969 New York Mets. And you know, growing up in New Jersey, you know, that team, that's one of my favorite all-time teams. And you know, that team, and you know, Muhammad Ali and Howard Cosell and Joe Frazier, all those really great fights.
Oh, yeah.
And the 1968 Olympics with the protests. You know, that was the stuff that, you know, made me want to do what I'm doing. Secretariat winning the Triple Crown in 1973. That gave me my love for horse racing, and that's where we, you know, that was the motivation to do this.
The glory days of it too. But I also remember in your last few years at 40, maybe the last year, the features that you would do.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still believe that's the best work I've ever seen you do.
It is. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
I stopped, you know,
it was all good, but that was, you got into it.
I did. You know, when you're, I did sports for all those years, and because of one reason or another, you know, they were, you know, cutting back on the sports effort.
Which many small stations
Many small stations do, and we had, what's his name, Mike, who's now down in Dallas.
Mike Leslie. Yeah.
Mike Leslie.
Yeah.
Mike Leslie was this young, you know, whippersnapper, and I was just like, you know what? Why don't you let him be the sports guy? And here's an idea. I want to go around and do feature stories like they do on CBS Sunday Morning. And everybody said yes, and I agree. That's the best work I've ever done.
Now, the other part of that, too, is you get to that point. It's not like you didn't like sports, but a lot of folks don't know this. It's like you didn't go down there with photographers. When you were shooting Friday Night Football or whatever else, you carried your own gear.
We did.
And you took a nasty hit one
I
night.
got nailed a couple of times, yeah. But we enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was part of like the creative process. I didn't want to do it every day, but yeah, we would go cover our games at night and shoot the video ourselves, and it was fun.
Yeah. But that has changed. I mean, as far as local sports, and we still do sports when there's big stories going around. But
Right.
you know, the day-to-day thing, I think the whole attitude is look, if you really want to know about the Red Sox or whatever else, you don't have to watch local news anymore.
You don't.
And that's, I mean, when you think back, really, to when I started and when you started, it was like a 7 or 8 minute chunk of the sports of the newscast itself.
Right. But and you know, and listen, to our credit, you know, we certainly did Red Sox highlights at 11 o'clock, but I think that 75% of what we did was local sports.
Yep.
And that was the only thing that you know, you couldn't get that anyplace else. So let's do that and let Madsen and all those other cable stations out of Boston handle the pro stuff. It was fun.
It was. So we come back to today, and you've got some time on the radio, but you're doing some selling too. So that's the major focus of your day.
It is. I left 40 in 2012 to go work for the Saga stations in sales, and had never done it before. And it's the best thing. It's the best thing that I've ever done. I still get my back scratched by being able to do the sports on the radio, but I sell advertising now, and it's really just been it's been a gift. I can't imagine not having had the opportunity to do what I'm doing now And if things were to just kind of been status quo, I would never have left 40, but I'm glad for the experience, and I'm really glad that I'm doing what I'm doing now.
It's like with anything else. I mean, when you're on the air, you were dealing with people day in and day out, and this is just dealing with them on a different level.
It is, and and so the funny thing is, it's like I'll walk into a business owner's place, and I don't even need to hand out a business card. Like the introduction's already made, and I can't tell you how many times a client has said to me, or someone who became a client, back in back in 2002, you made my daughter, Leslie, athlete of the week. She played basketball at, and I'm like, oh, and most times I remember.
Well, you don't realize the impact that you have on folks. And when I got through on the day-to-day basis, I would have people come up to me and say, well, you did, and there was one that for the life of me, I never remembered. I was in a convenience store, and I've come to find out this gentleman reminded me. He says, my son was in there and he didn't have enough change to buy anything, so you gave him the change. And he said, we've never forgotten that.
Yeah.
And it's little things like that. But when we go, what we did in 9/11. I mean, sports took a back seat. We all did news that time.
Right.
How the dynamic changes and the impact that, whether you're on television or radio, that you have on people on a day in and day out basis, that while you're in the middle of it, you don't realize you have it. And I think you're probably finding that out now.
I am. And remember when the tornado blew through, I was actually just talking about that. I was trying to figure out how old the roof on my house was, and we put it on right after the tornado came through. And it missed my street by like 2 blocks. It ripped right through East Forest Park. And we did tornado stories for a month.
For a month, we went to every neighborhood.
And I still bump into people, and they still talk about all the stuff that we did, and how helpful it was.
Well, remember, I think at the end of June, we were up in Madsen and doing a live remote up there.
Yep.
And from what we saw down here, we didn't realize how bad it was in Madsen until we came up there to see it. And a woman came up to Eddie Carroll and said, you have to understand that what you were doing that day saved lives up here.
There's no question about it. And so back to clients, Madsen Savings Bank is one of my radio clients. And so I have to go to Madsen, probably, 3-4 times a year, just to go check in, say hello, shake hands, kiss babies. And so you come down in there, and Dave, I look around and I think about the live shot that we did, and remember at that church right in the center of town, the steeple blew off,
yep.
And that's where we were camped out, and these girls were athletes too. There was a family up on the hill where the tornado came, and they actually saw it coming and ran down into the basement. The girls were home alone because it was right about dinner time. The parents had not come back from work yet, and they could have lost their 3 or 4 daughters that day, and they were saved. And they were watching the weather on channel 22 or 40 or whatever.
Exactly. So as we come down to the end of this podcast, and you still have many, many years left in your career, how would you like to be remembered when you say, okay, I'm done with this, and I'm gonna pay attention to Scott Coen?
Yep. I would want people to know that that I really enjoyed them giving us an opportunity to showcase their children. My first class of 17-year-olds, 15, they're married with their own kids now, and so that's a long time.
Yeah.
And I just it was just really great to have. We've been blessed to do the work that we've done in the market. So
we have. Very lucky.
Yep.
And lucky too. I realized as we were talking about doing this, is I've known you now for about 35 years.
35 years.
That's old friends.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is.
Thank you.
You bet, bud.
Good to see you, bud.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hope you enjoyed my talk with Scott Coen. Scott doing good things these days, and always good to see him. That's this week's edition of Even Better Western Mass. Next week, I sit down with Rob Bradford of WEEI.com. He and I got together a couple of weeks ago down at JetBlue Park in Fort Myers, Florida. So that's next week on Even Better Western Mass. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.